Welcome back, folks. Bob McKenzie of Fulton Woodworking here. This will be the third and final episode of the bar stool build. As you recall, last time we got the frames all assembled and ready for the backs and slat installation. This time we'll go back and finish up the backs, we'll finish the slats, we'll install those, and we'll finish the stools, and we'll wrap this thing up. Let's go into the shop and get this finished. As with many aspects of the stool, I was doing the design as I was going along. It took me a couple of shots before I finally came up with the back that I really liked. Now it's just a matter of taking my pattern and outlining it on the blanks and taking it over to the bandsaw and cutting them out. As for the slats, it was a matter of cutting both ends off at the appropriate location and then trimming them to width. I also had to notch two of the slats for each of the stools. Unfortunately, I do not have a video of that. After arriving at the basic shapes at the bandsaw, I took them to the workbench and worked on them at the sander. I sure wish I could have figured out a safe way to round over the edges of these convoluted shapes, but I just couldn't come up with one that I wanted to try. After I got everything sanded down, I assembled each of the chairs to match the grain as best as I possibly could, and then I marked the pieces, backs and the slats, for drilling. Each of the slats had two screws, one fore and one aft, and the backs had four, two on each side. I went about halfway through each piece with a 3/8 inch brad bit, which would accept a plug to cover the head of the screw. After I got all the holes drilled, I went back to the workbench and did what I call buffing these pieces out. I take these all the way down to a 4,000 grit buffing wheel. My original plan was to go with ash plugs and try to hide the holes, but I found because of the wide grain pattern in the ash, it was very difficult to get good matches, so I went with a contrasting plug, Mahogany and Walnut. After I get all the plugs drilled, I take a Sharpie and mark the top, which would be the inside or the tapered end of the plug, and then I cover them up with tape and head to the bandsaw. All the parts are ready, laid out for assembly. I used the Craig blue-coated screws because they're self-tapping and for indoor-outdoor use. To align the backs, I used tape instead of putting marks on the board, which had to have been erased or sanded off again. This is not an exact science. There's a lot of making it look right. I used glue sparingly to keep from getting any squeeze out. I used a driver to set the screws, but I always like to hand tighten the screws to keep from stripping them out or splitting any wood. I put the seat slats on first. I used a 1/2 inch dowel as a spacer and visually aligned them before attaching. Installing the plugs is pretty straightforward. I will note that due to the thickness of the back and the slats, these plugs are quite thin. After the glue dried on the plugs, I used the sander with a 150 grit sandpaper to smooth them out. This of course meant that I had to go back to these areas and buff this out all the way up to the 4,000 grit. My finish of choice for most projects now is BioShield Hard Oil number 9. It's actually a floor finish. I put 3 coats of oil on, waiting 24 hours between coats. I rub down each coat after about 20-30 minutes to get the excess oil off. It provides a nice smooth feel to the wood. I put these anti-skid pads on the end of the legs to keep the stools from sliding as well as protect them from chipping. For a thread lubricant, I use a damp bar of soap, in this case Ivory. The only true flat place in the building. There you go, folks. I appreciate you taking the time to go through the journey with me in putting together these bar stools. I hope you learned something, because I sure did in the process. And happy woodworking to all.